coming from the divine and his unconditional love, none of you would have developed, unfolded. And since we are in the presence of a human divine doing, it should be translated as Allah allows whoever wants to unfold, whoever wants to grow, whoever wants to bear fruit, the divine germ that is in us, to bring this germ to fruition.
Fadl.
We can fall into it. We can probably degrade ourselves without being aware of it. Hoped for. And it is a surplus, not too much, a surplus that is identifiable, that is distinguishable, that is manifest. The Arabs of the Quranic moment, when they use water and there is a surplus left, they call it
فضل الماء فضول الماء.
When they separate the herds, when he divides the herds according to the different owners of the animals, and the animals in addition, the heads in addition, the heads of burden in addition, he also calls them
فضل.
So there was the basic herd, and in fact the basic herd operated a form of overflow, growth, and development. The fact that after the distribution of the animals that go to each one, according to the number that belongs to each one, there is a surplus. There are more animals. There are extra heads. So the surplus is a form of growth, development, enrichment that is carried out, and which is not necessarily faced with a form of right, of due, of quid pro quo. In the Coran, we have this notion of fadl, which in reality, when we look at them, the occurrences of fadl in the Quran, if we look at them closely, we could read them all as being significant, indicating the prophetic figure, especially in its totalizing and universal sense, which we have spoken of in the notion of
ولكن رسول الله.
Allah tells us in the Quran.
فلولا فضل الله عليكم ورحمته.
So if it were not for a
fadl
from Allah, a fadl that comes from Allah, that emanates from
Allah,
and his unconditional love for you,
لكنت من الخاسرين.
You would surely have been among the losers, those who are in deficit, of those who have, in a way, wasted the potential that is in them, wasted their lives badly, wasted their lives in something that is not the purpose of their lives. This is the notion of
Khusrân.
There are two main types of trials for humans. The trial of the
طغيان.
Therefore the trial of imposture. And the evidence of what?
خسران.
So Allah, He tells us in
سورة الرحمن ووضع الميزان ألا تطغوا في الميزان وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط ولا تخسروا.
This is not the balance at all. I remind you that the
الميزان,
we will look at it. It does not mean the scale. Initially, it is the instrument of the charge. Afterwards, it can manifest itself in the world of men when they need to exchange, barter and measure what they barter or what is exchanged. They will use a scale. But initially,
الميزان
is the tool of the charge. And al-wazn means the burden that is in each of us, and that it will be a question of developing, of making it grow until it bears fruit. Until it is brought to the ripe fruit. And Allah tells us that in order to be able to do
قيام الوزن,
that is to say, to fully assume one's own responsibility, one must be in denial of the two extremes, the negation of imposture and the negation of
خسران.
It is neither imposing oneself in a place where one is not legitimate, and it is neither evading nor avoiding a place where one is legitimate, a place that corresponds to one's burden, a place that corresponds to one's obligation. And that's
خسران.
It is to evade. It is to flee and not to assume the burden that marks it. So Allah says in this verse,
فلولا فضل الله عليكم ورحمته لكنت من الخاسرين.
So one of the benefits and advantages of
فضل
is that you don't fall into this second type of trial. We can say that there are two main types of events. So we said imposture and deficit, waste. To avoid falling into this
خسران
we can rely on this.
فضل. قد أفلح من زكاها وقد خاب من دساها.
Certainly he has attained bliss, has tasted the fruit of effort, the one who what?
زكاها.
The one who makes his soul grow, develop, unfold. We will say otherwise now. The one who makes his seed grow, unfold his seed, bring a fruit from the seed. Moreover, in the verse I have quoted,
ولولا فضل الله عليكم ورحمته ما زكى منكم من أحد.
So if it were not for the effect of the surplus coming from the divine and his unconditional love, none of you would have developed, unfolded.
ولكن الله يزكي من يشاء.
And here we are in the presence of what I call the divine human doing.
الله يزكي من يشاء.
Often it's translated, but it's Allah who. So already it is translated as purify. Let's agree.
Tazkiya
is not purification. Tazkiya is development. It is fulfillment. It is growth. It is deployment. Purification is.
طهارة.
We have verses where we have both together.
تطهرهم وتزكيهم بها.
So there, this verse,
تطهرهم وتزكيهم.
you purify them and you allow them to develop. So that's the first thing. Then, secondly, here in the verse,
ولكن الله يزكي ما يشاء.
often it doesn't translate that Allah finally allows whomever He wants to unfold. And since we are in the presence of a human divine doing, it should be translated as Allah allows whoever wants to unfold. Whoever wants to grow, whoever wants to bear fruit, the divine germ that is in us, to bring this germ to fruition. So the
Tazkiya,
which can be possible thanks to this prophetic surplus. We have another verse.
ولولا فضل الله عليكم ورحمته وأن الله رؤوف رحيم.
There,
فضل,
the surplus, it intervenes as the trigger of a certain number of divine functions, of a certain number of divine attributes. And if we read the Quran, we can identify 4 of them.
رؤوف رحيم. رؤوف,
it's merciful.
الرأفة,
In Arabic, is precisely to have heart, empathy for the miserable state of a thing or a being. When a person finds himself in difficulty, as in the Quran, he tells us,
في ساعة العسر.
in difficult hours, in hours of narrowness, meaning the hours when the human being can be tested. In accordance with, I would say, what he has to work on, in accordance with his work area, in accordance with what he has to develop in himself. And in the Quran, in fact, there is a link between
الرأفة,
which I translate as mercy, and indeed all these somewhat miserable, somewhat painful states that humans can go through in their lives.
رؤوف رحيم. وأن الله رؤوف رحيم.
See that there is a difference between
رؤوف
and
رحيم.
therefore. Allah, He is indulgent with us, and His indulgence can be triggered thanks to this prophetic surplus.
ولولا فضل الله ورحمته وأن الله رؤوف رحيم.
Again, the notion of
رحمة.
We have another verse.
قل بفضل الله ورحمته فبذلك فليفرحوا هو خير مما يجمعون.
It is through the divine surplus and His unconditional love that He is more decent, that it is more suitable of what? To be in this
فرح.
state
فرح.
is joy, it is enthusiasm, it is gaiety, with a form of jubilation, inner rejoicing.
هو خير مما يجمعون.
This
فضل
of Allah is better than what can be gathered by billions or herds. By the way, it reminds me that there was a tradition that does not refer to the Prophet, but to companions where Omar attended the count. There was another companion who was counting the heads of his cattle, and who was super happy to see that what? There are more faces than before.
بفضل الله هذا من فضل الله.
And Omar corrects him. He said, law.
هذا ليس من فضل الله. قل بفضل الله وبرحمته فبذلك فليفرحوا هو خير مما يجمعون.
The faddle is in the Quran, in the prophetic figure, and that's what we should rejoice in, and not what we can amass in terms of materiality, which at times can provide a form of rejoicing, a form of gaiety, a form of jubilation, and a form of joy.
So the Prophet
sallallahu alaihi wasallam
actually enjoying the surplus is what finally allows us to achieve the effect of bliss.
الفرح
As the effect of the
فلاح. الفرح,
this jubilation, this inner enjoyment, this joy is the effect of
الفلاح.
Of earthly bliss, of the fruit of effort. So there's something unsaid in there. It means that you have to make an effort. It's not because there's the surplus that it's there, that necessarily, I want to say, with a wave of a magic wand, it will produce its effects. Of course, it must be integrated, recognized, triggered. Make yourself available to this surplus. It's still a question of availability. So these are a few examples of how this prophetic surplus can manifest itself, and what can be its effects, its advantages, and its benefits for any journeyer, male or female. So often it is translated Allah and His angels. Greet upon the Prophet, pray upon the Prophet. So anyone who is in a form of
Iman,
in this journey of
Iman, صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.
Pray over him and make greetings for him or upon him. It is a meaning that can be understood, except that it is not a meaning that is in accordance with the Quranic letter.
صلى.
It literally means exposing oneself to fire. For what? To be able to stand up and get into a position of verticalization, the vertical position. The Arabs of the Quranic moment use this root to mean this. To expose something to the fire in order to straighten it out, something that would be bent, under the weight of guilt, under the weight
مشاكل.
of problems. And in Arabic, when you have a verb and you learn a particle,
صلى عليه إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي.
the particle
على.
here, rather than saying on, it can introduce, I'll put it like this, a direct object complement. In the sense of making the object that comes after the particle, the meaning mentioned just before. So there, literally, it would mean
Allah
and his angels make the prophet, make the
النبي صلاة.
a tool of exposure to heat, a tool of exposure. At the fire, it was said that the prophet,
صلى الله عليه وسلم
like the
الشمس
in the Quran, they are called
سراج.
torch. There are not two other things. A third thing in the Quran that is called an incandescent torch. To make the prophet,
صلى الله عليه وسلم صلاة.
that is to say, an opportunity to expose himself to the fire in order to predispose himself to stand upright. And it is once one is predisposed and verticalized, or verticalized to be predisposed to walk, that one can actually rise on the ladder of self-realization. It is true when Allah says,
صلوا عليه
make him an instrument that will allow you to stand up.
وسلموا تسليما.
And at that time, what will you be able to operate? An ascent on the ladder of self-realization. Moreover, it is true that we have not yet had the opportunity to mention this famous,
الإسراء والمعراج.
in particular,
المعراج.
which means
معراج.
linguistically, the tool of ascension by degree. The tool of ascent, let's put it like that, by degree. We are not going to introduce the notion of oblicity today. That's something which happened to the Prophet Muhammad.
صلى الله عليه وسلم.
And you know, in the Quran, there are several ways to understand terms based on other terms. Either Allah will correlate them in correspondence, or He will put them in a form of opposition. When I say correspondence, I mean a correspondence. Now, there can be two types of correspondence. An etymological, semantic correspondence at the level of meaning, or a correspondence, because it is the structure of the text that makes us say that such and such a word is in correspondence with such and such another word. For example, in
سورة الفاتحة مغضوب عليهم
He is in opposition to.
الرحمن الرحيم.
So we understand that
الغضب
is the opposite of
رحمة.
and the
رحمة
is the opposite of the.
غضب.
There's another matching game. These are numerological correspondences by the numerical value of words. And in fact, when we identify the numerical value of the word
معراج.
which means tool of ascent by degree, and the numerical value of the word Muhammad, we find exactly the same numerical value.
المعراج.
His numerical value is 314.
محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم.
His numerical value is 314. And here we are talking about.
محمد ما كان محمد أبا أحد من.
So when we say
يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه.
we're talking about
نبي. محمد.
make
محمد.
this
صلاة.
so this tool. So there we understand that there are two things. We introduce a new element. It's a tool that will allow us to expose ourselves to him actually. All right? To expose ourselves to this
سراج.
torch which is itself,
صلى الله عليه وسلم.
in order to put ourselves in a position of verticalization, and in doing so, to allow us to evolve in stages that are opposed to the degradation I mentioned earlier, which, when we do not protect ourselves from this degradation by the
فضل.
we can fall into it. We can probably degrade ourselves without being aware of it. So the Prophet,
صلى الله عليه وسلم.
as an opportunity to rise in steps through the different figures that are his.
يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.
So, in reality, its deepest meaning is not making
صلوات.
about the Prophet. That's a predisposition. When we do it, we're going to do it
بإذن الله.
right away. When we say,
اللهم صل وسلم على حبيبك محمد.
what are we predisposing ourselves to? To indeed, that indeed each of us can make,
محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. الصلاة.
and in doing so, allow each and every one of us to do what? To rise in steps on the ladder of self-realization.
وسلموا تسليما.
The
سلامة.
root initially, it does not mean peace. It means the ladder. A ladder is two uprights, rather, and then the rungs. It also means alignment. And indeed, to be able to rise in steps on this ladder of self-realization, two things are needed. We must be in an upright position, and the three dimensions of our being must be aligned. A form of alignment of dimensions, alignment of parts. Sometimes there are parts of us that want to go to the right and parts of us that want to go to the left. You can't climb the ladder if that's the way it is. It is absolutely necessary that all the parts that make up our being be aligned on this scale of self-realization. So,
اللهم صل يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه
make him a
صلاة وسلموا تسليما.
and at that time you will be able to do the
تسليم.
that is to say, to rise in steps on the ladder of self-realization and fulfillment and unfolding. On the ladder of the fruition of the germ, on the scale of the fruiting of the seed.